You think you have time, but what if the life you're building right now is quietly pulling you in the wrong direction, and you won't even realize it until it's too late? Because here's the uncomfortable truth no one wants to say out loud. You can spend your entire life chasing everything the world tells you matters and still end up with absolutely nothing that actually does. It sounds dramatic, but it's not. In fact, it's something you already know deep down. You came into this world with nothing. And no matter how much you collect, no matter how much you achieve, no matter how much recognition you earn, one day you will walk out of it the exact same way, empty-handed. But there's a twist that changes everything, because you don't leave with nothing. You leave with only two things: the love you received and the love you gave. And suddenly, everything you thought mattered starts to feel a little fragile. But here's where it gets uncomfortable, because most people don't live like that's true. Instead, they spend years, decades, even chasing validation from a world that has never truly cared about them. A world that rewards noise over truth, appearance over substance, and success over meaning. And if you stop for just a second and really think about it, why would you want validation from a world that once rejected and destroyed perfection itself? That question alone should shake something inside you. Because if the world could reject what is perfect, what chance does anything else have? And yet, we still chase it. We chase money because we think it will give us freedom, but it often just gives us more reasons to feel empty. We chase status because we think it will give us identity, but it usually just replaces who we really are. And we chase pleasure because we think it will give us peace, but it leaves us restless the moment it fades. And the strangest part, even when we start to realize it's not working, we don't stop. We just chase harder. But why? Why does something inside us constantly pull us toward the very things that drain us? The answer is more unsettling than you might expect, because the battle you're fighting isn't just external, it's internal. There's a part of you that constantly craves what pulls you away from what actually matters. Part of you that whispers just a little more, just one more step, just one more compromise, and it never seems satisfied. Ever wonder why? Because that part of you doesn't care where you end up. It's not thinking about your future. It's not thinking about your purpose. It's not thinking about eternity. It just wants what it wants right now. And that creates a quiet war inside you, a tension you feel but can't always explain. One side pulling you toward meaning, the other pulling you toward distraction. And most of the time, distraction wins, not because it's stronger, but because it's easier. And that's exactly how people drift. Not with one big decision, but with 1,000 small ones. But every once in a while, something happens that interrupts that drift. Something that forces you to stop, to question, to wake up. And sometimes that moment doesn't come from success, it comes from pain. Because pain has a way of exposing truth that comfort hides. And for one man, that moment came in a way that shattered everything. At just 11 years old, his world collapsed in a way no child should ever experience. Something was done to him that wasn't just wrong, it was deeply destructive. The kind of experience that doesn't just hurt you, it changes how you see everything. It plants confusion where there should be clarity. It replaces trust with anger. And it leaves behind a question that doesn't go away. Where was God? And when that question doesn't get answered, something inside you starts to close. So he made a decision, not out of logic, but out of pain. He walked away, not just from faith, but from anything connected to it. Because when something sacred becomes the source of your deepest wound, it's easier to reject it entirely than try to understand it. And just like that, the direction of his life changed. But here's where the story takes a turn you might not expect, because he didn't fall apart. He succeeded. He chased the world and he caught it. He built the life people dream about. He moved into one of the most competitive cities in the world. He climbed into a high-powered career. He made money, real money, the kind that gives you access, influence, status. He surrounded himself with everything that signals success from the outside. And if you looked at his life from a distance, you'd probably think he made it. But there was just one problem. He wasn't happy. And not just in a casual something feels off kind of way. It was deeper than that. Because when you've achieved everything you thought would fulfill you, and you don't just feel disappointed, you feel lost, because now you don't know what to chase next. And that's a dangerous place to be. So he did what many people do in that moment. He tried to fill the gap. A relationship, a beautiful one, at least on the surface. It felt like a new beginning, a fresh direction. Something that might finally bring meaning into everything he had built. And for a while, it worked. Until it didn't. Because just like everything else he had chased, it didn't last. And when it ended, it didn't just leave him where he started. It left him lower, more confused, more empty. Because now, even the things that once gave him hope were gone. And this is where most people either numb themselves or distract themselves or double down on the same patterns that led them there. But something different happened. Not immediately, not dramatically, but quietly, something began to shift. It started with a trip, one that wasn't supposed to be meaningful at all. Just another experience, another escape, another way to get away from everything that wasn't working. But sometimes the moments that seem the least important are the ones that change everything. Because what he found there wasn't what he expected at all. He thought he was walking into something familiar, something comfortable, something predictable. But instead, he stepped into a place that felt completely different, simpler, slower, almost like time had been left behind. And at first, it didn't impress him. In fact, it confused him because it didn't match the life he was used to. And that's exactly why it worked. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't surrounded by noise. No distractions, no pressure, no expectations, just silence. And in that silence, something happened the next morning that he couldn't explain. He woke up and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not surface level calm, not temporary relief, but something deeper, something steady, something real. And it didn't make sense because nothing around him had changed. His life was still the same. His problems were still there. His past hadn't disappeared. But somehow he felt different. And that's when the questions started forming. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to change everything. What if I've been looking in the wrong place this whole time? But instead of answering that question immediately, something even more unexpected was waiting for him. Because the very next step he took would confront him in a way he never saw coming. And it would begin with a decision he almost didn't make. The strange thing about turning points is that they rarely feel like turning points in the moment. They feel small, almost insignificant, like something you could easily ignore. And that's exactly what this was. Supposed to be a small step, nothing more, just a quiet decision, almost casual, but it carried a weight he didn't yet understand. Because the next move he made wasn't comfortable. It wasn't exciting. And it definitely wasn't something the old version of him would have chosen. It was confession. Now, on the surface, that might not sound dramatic. But for someone who had spent over 2 decades running in the opposite direction, this wasn't just a step, it was a collision with everything he had been avoiding. Because confession isn't just about saying words. It's about facing truth. And truth, when you've been hiding from it, can feel unbearable. So naturally, he hesitated. Not because he didn't know what to do, but because he knew exactly what it would require. It would mean opening doors he had kept locked for years. It would mean saying things out loud that he had buried. It would mean letting someone see the version of himself he didn't even want to admit existed. And that's why, instead of going straight in, he did something almost funny. He went scouting. He started looking around, watching the priests, trying to figure out who looked safe, not too strict, not too intense, someone who wouldn't judge him too hard. Because even now, even in this moment of change, there was still a part of him trying to control the outcome. And then he found him. A priest who didn't look intimidating at all, relaxed, easygoing, almost casual. the kind of person you'd assume wouldn't make things uncomfortable, and in his mind that was perfect. But what he didn't realize was that this moment wasn't going to go the way he expected. Because when he finally sat down and started speaking, something unexpected happened. He didn't hold back. What was supposed to be a simple confession turned into everything. Years of decisions, years of mistakes, years of running, it all came out. Not polished, not filtered, just raw truth. And maybe for the first time in a long time, he wasn't performing. He wasn't pretending. He was just honest. And then it ended. The priest listened, gave absolution, simple, direct. And then he said something that made no sense. I think you have a vocation to be a priest. And just like that, everything stopped. Because this wasn't just unexpected, it was absurd. This was a man who had spent years chasing the world, a man who had walked away from faith, a man who had built a life completely disconnected from anything spiritual. And now someone was telling him that his future might be the exact opposite of everything he had become. It didn't just sound wrong. It sounded impossible. So he laughed it off, dismissed it, walked away. But here's the problem with moments like that. They don't leave. Because even when you reject them, they stay with you, quietly, patiently, waiting. And the more you try to ignore them, the louder they become. So he did what most people do when faced with something they don't understand. He went back to his old life, back to the city, back to the routine, back to the environment that had defined him for years. But this time, something was different. Because once you've experienced something real, even briefly, everything else starts to feel off. And suddenly, the life that once felt normal started to feel heavy. The friendships that once felt natural started to feel misaligned. The habits that once felt harmless started to feel empty. And that's when the real shift began. Because change doesn't happen all at once. It happens in layers. First, he started letting go of the people who were pulling him backward. Not because they were bad, but because they were part of a version of his life that no longer fit. And that's one of the hardest things anyone can do, walk away from what's familiar, even when it's not healthy. Then he started moving towards something new, not perfectly, not confidently, but intentionally. He found a different circle, people who were living differently, thinking differently, believing differently, and slowly, without even realizing it, his daily life began to shift. He started showing up to Mass, not once in a while, but consistently. He started going to confession regularly, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. And that's when something deeper started happening. Because routine creates rhythm, and rhythm creates transformation. But even then, there was still a question that hadn't been answered. What am I supposed to do with my life? And for the first time, instead of answering it himself, he was challenged to do something completely different. Ask, not plan, not control, not decide. Ask, and at first, it felt almost too simple. Lord, what do you want me to do with my life? That was it. No complicated formula, no long ritual, just a question. So he tried it once, twice, a few times. Nothing. A week passed, still nothing. And just like that, the frustration came back. Because in his mind, he had done his part. He asked the question, he showed up, he waited, and there was no response, which led to a conclusion that most people reach at some point. Maybe this just isn't real. But when he brought that frustration back, he didn't get comfort. He got correction, because the response he received wasn't gentle, it was direct. You left for 22 years, and you're upset because you didn't get an answer in 7 days. And suddenly, the perspective shifted, because the problem wasn't that there was no answer. The problem was that he wasn't ready to receive it. So he kept going, day after day, same question, same silence. But something was changing, not outside, inside. Because patience has a way of reshaping you without you noticing. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into more than a year. And just when it seemed like nothing was happening, everything happened. It was an ordinary morning. Nothing unusual. No buildup. No warning. Just a quiet moment after receiving communion when suddenly he heard it. Clear, direct, undeniable. Come follow me. Not a thought, not a feeling, a voice. And for a second, everything froze. Because this wasn't something you could ignore. This wasn't something you could explain away. This wasn't something you could pretend didn't happen. It was real. And it changed everything in an instant. But here's where it gets even more intense. It didn't stop there, because throughout that same day, the exact same message came again. And again, different moments, different forms, same words. Come follow me. At that point, it wasn't a coincidence. It was a call. And suddenly, all the questions, all the waiting, all the confusion, it all pointed to one unavoidable reality. He couldn't go back to the life he had before, but stepping forward would cost him everything. And this is the moment where most people hesitate, because clarity is powerful, but it's also terrifying. Because once you know what you're supposed to do, you lose the excuse of not knowing. And now, the only question left was this: would he actually do it? Or would he walk away one more time? Because the next decision he made wouldn't just change his direction, it would completely dismantle his entire life. There's a moment that comes after clarity, a moment no one really talks about. It's not the excitement of discovering your purpose, and it's not the peace of living it either. It's the gap in between where you know exactly what you're supposed to do, but doing it means losing everything you've built. And that's where he was standing. Because hearing, "Come follow me," sounds powerful until you realize what it actually requires. It doesn't mean adjusting your life. It doesn't mean improving your habits. It means leaving, letting go, starting over completely. And the truth is, most people never make that jump. Not because they don't hear the call, but because they calculate the cost. But he didn't wait. He didn't overanalyze. He didn't negotiate. Within days, he made a decision that didn't just surprise the people around him, it shocked them. He walked away just like that. The career, the income, the identity he had spent years building. He didn't try to hold on to pieces of it. He let it go completely. He gave notice, closed the chapter, and stepped into something he didn't fully understand yet. And at first, it felt right. Clear direction, strong conviction, a sense of purpose that had been missing for years. But what he didn't realize was that clarity doesn't mean the path will be easy. In fact, sometimes it means the opposite. Because the moment you step into something real, resistance shows up. And it showed up fast. The first place he went rejected him. Not gently, not thoughtfully, immediately. You're not called, leave. That was it. No explanation, no process, just rejection. And if you pause there for a second, you can feel how confusing that must have been. Because just days earlier, he had received one of the clearest confirmations of his life. And now, the very place that was supposed to affirm it shut the door in his face. So which one was true? The call or the rejection? Because when those two things collide, most people don't keep going. They assume they were wrong. They assume they imagined it. They assume it wasn't real. And they go back. But he didn't, not because it made sense, but because something inside him refused to let go of what he had experienced. Even if the path didn't look the way he expected, he knew the direction was still right. And then everything around him changed. because just as he was trying to figure out his next step, the world itself shifted. September 11th, a moment that didn't just impact the city. It shook the entire world. And for him, it wasn't distant. It wasn't something he watched on a screen. It was right there, close, personal, real. The place he lived, covered in ash. The air, heavy. The atmosphere, different. And in moments like that, priorities change fast. Because when life becomes fragile, clarity becomes urgent. Suddenly, everything temporary feels exactly what it is temporary. And everything eternal starts to matter more. But even in the middle of that chaos, something unexpected was waiting for him. Another interruption, another moment he didn't plan, another voice, but this time through a person. It happened at a gathering filled with grief. Hundreds of people carrying loss, pain that didn't have words. And in the middle of it, a priest noticed him. Not randomly, intentionally. Tell that guy, I want to talk to him. And again, he found himself face to face with a question he wasn't prepared for. What are you doing with your life? Not how are you? Not are you okay? Straight to the point. And for a moment, it almost felt offensive. Who asks that? Who walks up to someone and cuts straight through everything like that? But maybe that's exactly why it mattered. Because sometimes the questions we don't like are the ones we need the most. And his answer? Nothing, no job, no home, no clear direction. Everything he had built, gone. Everything he thought he knew, uncertain. And instead of sympathy, he got another unexpected response. Maybe the Lord is calling you here. And then, just like that, the priest walked away. No explanation, no pressure. Just a seed planted and left there. And at first, he ignored it because it didn't feel strong enough. It didn't feel clear enough. It didn't feel like the kind of confirmation he was waiting for. So he pushed it aside, told himself it wasn't enough, and moved on. But something about it didn't sit right. Because even though it didn't feel overwhelming, it felt persistent. And eventually, he did something simple but important. He prayed about it, not dramatically, not emotionally, just honestly. And that led to a decision that seemed small, but wasn't. I'll go just for a weekend. That's it. No commitment, no long-term plan, just a short visit to say he tried. But just like before, what he expected wasn't what he found. Because the priest he had brushed off wasn't ordinary. He was different, not just in what he said, but in how he lived. Because there's a difference between talking about something and actually living it. And this man didn't just speak about faith, he embodied it. Every moment, every action, every decision, it wasn't part of his life, it was his life. And that kind of authenticity is hard to ignore. So what was supposed to be a weekend turned into 9 months. 9 months of watching, learning, being shaped, not through lectures, but through example. And during that time, something started happening again. Transformation. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Because when you're around something real long enough, it changes you. But just as things began to settle, another storm hit. This time, not external, personal, because the very issue that had broken him as a child came back publicly, massively. The entire world was now talking about it. Accusations, scandals, anger, division, and suddenly, the place he had gone to grow became the center of everything he had tried to escape. And now he had to face it again. But this time, it was different. Because before he ran, now he stayed, not because it was easy, but because healing doesn't happen by avoiding pain. It happens by walking through it. And what he discovered in that process would completely change how he saw his past. because the thing that once felt like it destroyed him was about to become the very thing that gave his life purpose. But he didn't see that yet. Not fully, because first he had to go through something even harder. Rejection. Again and again and again. Doors closing, opportunities disappearing, years passing without the outcome he thought he was working toward. And at some point, you have to ask the question no one wants to ask. What if I'm doing all of this and it still doesn't work? Because faith sounds powerful until it's tested. Calling sounds clear until it's delayed. And purpose feels real until it's challenged. And now he was in that space, waiting, working, trusting, but not seeing the result. And this is where most people quit. Not at the beginning, but in the middle, because the middle is where doubt lives. The middle is where silence stretches. The middle is where you start wondering if you misunderstood everything. But what he didn't know yet was that this delay wasn't a denial. It was preparation, because what was coming next would require a version of him that didn't exist yet. And the only way to become that person was to go through everything he was facing right now. But how long would it take? And more importantly, would he last long enough to find out? The hardest truth about transformation is this: it doesn't happen when everything makes sense. It happens when nothing does, and you choose to keep going anyway. Because by this point, the story should have been over. He had left everything behind. He had followed the call. He had endured rejection, confusion, delay, and still nothing had fully come together. No clear arrival, no final confirmation. Just years of moving forward without knowing if the destination would ever appear. And that's where most people quietly give up. Not in a dramatic way, but slowly. They stop expecting. They stop believing. They start settling because it feels safer to accept less than to keep hoping for something that might never come. But he didn't stop, not because he always felt strong, but because something deeper had taken root. Something that wasn't based on results, but on trust. And that trust carried him through 12 long years. 12, think about that for a second. 12 years of trying, of waiting, of being turned away, of watching doors close while holding onto a call that no one else could fully see. That's not motivation, that's perseverance. And perseverance doesn't come from excitement, it comes from conviction. And finally, after all of that time, the door opened. Not where he first expected, not how he first imagined, but exactly where he was meant to be. He was accepted, formed, and eventually ordained. And just like that, the thing that once seemed impossible became real. But here's where the story takes another turn, because you would think this is where everything settles. This is where life becomes stable, predictable, peaceful. But purpose doesn't work like that. Because once you step into what you're meant to do, the responsibility doesn't decrease, it increases. And his mission wasn't ordinary. He wasn't just called to serve. He was called to confront darkness directly, to step into situations most people avoid, to face things most people don't even believe are real, because the wounds he carried had become something else. They had become tools. And this is the part that changes everything. Because for years, that pain from his childhood looked like destruction. It looked like something that ruined his life, something that took from him, something that broke him. But now it had meaning, because the very thing that once made him feel powerless had become the reason he could help others reclaim their strength. And that's when he understood something most people never do. God doesn't waste pain, not a single moment of it. What feels like loss can become purpose. What feels like damage can become direction. What feels like the end can become the beginning of something far greater than you imagined. But only if you let it. And that's the part people struggle with, because it requires surrender, not partial surrender. not conditional surrender, complete. The kind where you stop asking, why did this happen to me? And start asking, what can this become? And when that shift happens, everything changes. Because now you're no longer defined by what happened to you. You're defined by what you do with it. And that's exactly what happened. Because at one point, he was asked a question that forced him to face his past in a way he never had before. If you could go back and remove the pain, would you? And that question isn't easy, because your instinct is to say yes. Of course you would. Who wouldn't want to erase something that hurt them that deeply? But his answer was no, not because the pain wasn't real, not because it didn't matter, but because of what it became. Because through that pain, he found purpose. Through that suffering, he found direction. Through that brokenness, he became someone capable of helping others heal. And without it, that version of him wouldn't exist. That's not something you understand quickly. That's something you grow into. And when you finally see it, it changes how you look at everything. Because suddenly, your story isn't something you're trying to escape. It's something you're meant to use. And that realization leads to something even more powerful. Responsibility. Because once you know your life has purpose, you can't ignore it. You can't go back to living casually. You can't pretend it doesn't matter. Because now you understand your choices don't just affect you. They ripple outward into the lives of people you may never even meet. And that's why the next part of this matters so much. Because everything comes down to one decision. Not a big one, not a complicated one, a simple one, but one that determines everything that follows. Yes or no. That's it. Because every transformation in this story started with that. Yes, I'll go. Yes, I'll try. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll trust. And eventually, yes, I'll follow. But here's the part most people miss. You don't say it once. You say it every day. In small moments, in difficult choices, in uncomfortable situations. You say it when it's easy and when it's not. Because that's how a life changes. Not through one decision, but through consistent ones. And when you live that way, something begins to happen. You start to see differently. You start to respond differently. You start to live with an awareness that most people never develop. Because you realize something that was true all along. You were never alone. Not in your success. Not in your failure. Not in your confusion. Not in your pain. And once you start living like that's real, your entire life shifts. The way you treat people changes. The way you handle challenges changes. The way you see yourself changes. Because now you're not just reacting to life. You're walking through it with purpose. And that purpose doesn't remove the storms. They still come. They always will. But now you walk through them differently. Not with fear, but with confidence. Because, no matter what happens, you're not walking alone. And that's the difference between a life that drifts and a life that moves with direction. So now the question isn't about his story anymore. It's about yours. Because at some point, you'll face the same decision. Maybe not in the same way. Maybe not as dramatically, but it will come. A moment where you feel the pull towards something more. A moment where you know you can't keep living the same way. A moment where you're asked quietly, clearly, will you follow? And when that moment comes, everything will depend on your answer. Not tomorrow, not someday, but in that moment, because the truth is, the life you're meant to live is already waiting for your yes. And it always has been.